room is frightening. I will probably get nervous and stammer a bit, but hopefully you'll take that in stride. So let's just get started. I actually gave this presentation, some of it, at an ISSA conference this last fall, and there were all 3 people in the room. And it was unfortunate that it was because there was a lot of other exciting presentations going on. So there's one benefit from having a single track, and that is you don't really have any options. You're a captive audience. Other than, if the beer shows up and you all leave, I'll know it's frighteningly boring. But yeah, so I actually started off my career in chemical engineering, and that didn't work out, so then I went back to music and then eventually became a computer scientist. So it's been a long, crazy road. A number of roles that I've had there, but my present role is the threat intelligence manager at a Fortune 100 insurance company, who I will not name by name because they have not cleared this talk. So my management has, but we have, as you might imagine, in a large organization of that nature, and we'll get into that more as the presentation proceeds, a lot of legacy controls, especially around what you can and cannot say, and what you can and cannot share, and what you cannot publish. And so there's a very selective set of things that I can say with official sanction. So to give me more leverage and more freedom of speech will just not involve them directly. So most of my experiences that I'm talking about actually do come out of that work environment. So you may or may not find how many work for, well, how many work? And probably, I'm guessing, probably for medium and small sized businesses, and maybe a handful of large corporations. So your experiences will vary quite widely, of course. There is, speaking of varying widely, a lot of dissension about what is actually threat intelligence. So this definition actually comes from Gartner and seems to be a popular one, at least in some of the marketing press that you find. It's not a bad one to work with, but basically we're looking for evidence of compromise or indicators of compromise or things that might tell us that bad things are going on. And we want to see that in an informed way with context that allows us to apply it to our own business environments. And not only that, we would like to at some point be able to leverage that information to give us a predictive capability. So there's a lot of expectations that are coming associated with threat intelligence and what we do with that. That's probably difficult to read. Why do we really want it? Touched upon some of that now, but we really want early warnings so that we can have an adaptive response and we can make more effective incident response, but not just incident response. In many organizations, what we find is we're actually reactive. We're not really setting up a response, but just day-to-day reaction from a lot of things that are going on. Even with groups that are mature in other aspects of their security infrastructure or their enterprise security architectures, incident response, in my experience, has been a relatively weak area. But that, again, based on my actual experiences. Different companies I've worked for have had really mature incident response capabilities, others not so mature. It really is kind of all over the map. This idea of adaptive response is, I think, important because what we really want to eventually get to is not just incident response, but a continual adaptive response. So there really isn't an ebb and flow between actual fires that are occurring, but just day-to-day handling of what is normal business. I think part of the mantra that we've heard recently, and we see it more in the news, there are more companies that are being breached on a day-to-day basis, establishing an expectation at the board level that we will be hacked. Hacking is an inevitable occurrence, and you should simply be prepared to respond to that in a timely fashion. That's a paradigm shift, especially at board level, and executive level management in companies, because until recent times, the strategy has been, let's avoid being hacked altogether, and if you did get hacked, then it's time for the pink slip of the CISO, right? It's time to get him marching out the door and bring in another regime who basically goes through the same exercise in another 6 to 12 months. And I think as large breaches occur on a more frequent basis, fewer CISOs are going to lose their job as a result, just a personal opinion. And that's probably a good thing, because you really need continuity at that level. So driving better, more effective incident response. It's tied very closely to incident response. I almost have to start this talk with venting. And so this is my venting slide. What have I had? You know, years of going to Black Hat and DEF CON, and my justifications for going were maintain situational threat awareness. What's going on? What are the bad guys doing that we need to defend against? Or as a pen tester, what are the key areas that I need to be focused on to keep my skills sharp? So, problem is, executives and management didn't always get on board with that argument, right? They, oh, you're going to Vegas to party. What are you going to learn out there? You know, or you're just hanging out with a bunch of guys that just like to drink all the time. Well, yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. But there really is a lot of value to be gained from these community-based sharing exercises, and I think finally we're seeing staff, at least in my personal experience, I'm seeing executive management that's getting on board with that, and it comes in no small part to regime change. So the old guys are retiring and leaving, and we're bringing in new people who have the right threat or defensive level posture mindsets. So those antagonistic CISOs are starting to go away. The negative views of hacker history still lingers, but I think we're working through that. If we have some more psychoanalysis sessions, maybe we can admit that we have issues and start a 12-step program and leave our hacker sort of history behind at least for a bit and put on a clean white shirt when we go to work instead of a black one. Oh wait, the paradigm shift now beyond just mindset is getting budget, and that has been, at least in my current situation, getting money to stand up a program is a problem, and part of that is you really have to show the financial justification. What are you going to deliver as a threat intelligence program that the business will find useful? Show what the expenses are going to be. And you've got some clear expenses that are going to start coming out of once you start looking at the architecture of how you implement threat intelligence. So their costs are going to be associated with people, with implementing processes that have to integrate with existing business workflows, and there's costs there. But there's basically baseline project costs because you have to have these internal projects to integrate your existing business into what you plan to do as a threat intelligence group or person within your companies. So these are hidden costs that you may not have thought about, but they really are there, and you have to still make the justification in terms of people time to executives that as you try to implement these programs. Yeah, not having a dedicated team is a real problem. And for me, being that guy who came in wearing a lot of hats, being the token hacker that was brought into the larger security group, and being, for a while, the sole enterprise architect for the company for security architecture, when I was then given the role of being the threat intelligence manager, I didn't really get to put those other roles aside, right? So I basically had to, keep shifting the hat all the time. And that really is a problem when you're tasked with actually doing threat intelligence collection and analysis and doing reporting, but also writing program documents around that. And, oh, wait, you still are on all these other review boards. There's really there's no time. So the thing that you really probably have to accept is, that 40 or 60-hour work week now just became an 80 or 90-hour work week. Yeah, really. At least, yeah, exactly. Well, for some people, maybe so. I'm reaching an age where it's challenging. It really is. So what work-life balance? It's, forget about it. At least in my case. I think we eventually want to get there because that, I think, is important that we maintain that. We'll start having burnout. If you're not already burning out, you will be burning out the more you try to do of this nature. Just my experience. I am worn out. I've kept some slides in here that I had from previous talks, and we'll just kind of breeze through those. But really, there's integrations that you need to do into your existing enterprise security architectures. And if you haven't done those architectures, it's important that you take a step back and say, am I really ready to implement a threat intelligence program? Because I think a threat intelligence program is really more of an advanced topic. So if you haven't done the basics, it's probably time to step back and evaluate where you are in your security program and say, what's left to do, and when is the right time to start thinking about plugging things in. So you can always find useful reference architectures. In my case, we're basing ours on ISO 27000. It's a common risk management framework, and most companies, at least in the private sector, are using something like that, if not that exactly. We at the moment are totally revamping our policy sets, and I think that's a useful exercise as well, because when revisions come out to ISO 27, for example, the most recent one is 2013, you should take a hard look at your policy set and make sure that it's actually aligned with what the current revision has to say about your control set. You should examine all your controls and make sure that those are well implemented. The one thing I like to keep up in front of us is this ISMS model, Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, and that really does apply directly to not just ISMS and your risk management framework, but it's also a key part of the discussion when we talk about threat intelligence and how you actually implement that. So just generally speaking, remember the OODA loop, without saying where OODA came from. But breaking that down, you want to establish your plans and make sure that those are well formulated. You have an implementation plan for operations, kind of what we're here to talk about for threat intelligence. Monitor and review that so you have a governance layer to ensure that you're meeting your key objectives and that you have key performance indicators defined. And that I think is also important. That you want achievable results that you communicate to your management team, and they are in line on board with that. You want that going up front. You don't want to just run your shop as an ad hoc shop, where you'll continuously be in an ad hoc mode. And then, of course, act, maintain, and improve, and optimize your workflows. And there's some legacy stuff here. This is a comprehensive slide I found of the ISMS implementation certification process. Not what we're here to talk about. Our process flow is not quite that complicated, but it breaks down in a similar fashion, and you really probably do want to spend time documenting your process flow as part of program documentation. That will get you a lot of traction with executive management, at least in large organizations. It's actually a key part of what I find myself doing. As a threat intelligence manager, I spend more time documenting process flows than I do doing threat intelligence. So it's kind of sad that way, all the corporate management overhead. Again, the process loop, just another way of formulating that. It's interesting to me that this presentation actually integrated threats. By the way, this set of content is not my own. And if you want the actual links to these slides, I'd be happy to give you the deck, but also the references for where all the content is taken from. So I think it's important to work off the shoulders of others and elevate ourselves, which is another way of saying it's plagiarize like heck and steal your content. But give credit to those who actually did the work, because I think we don't want the same thing done to us when we actually get around to designing new and creative content, right? So I think it's important to give attribution. So I do have all the citations if and when you want those. This is interesting to me, this idea of developing a maturity scorecard. This is actually also correlated with the NIST cybersecurity framework, the idea of developing a profile and showing what your target profile is. So not every company should be at the same maturity level, either in your ISMS program, but also in your threat intelligence program. You're obviously going to start out at a less mature program level, and you're going to work towards being more mature, but you really want to plan that so that you can say, well, at 6 months from now, I want to be doing these activities, and I want to have the staff to support that, and here's the investment cost I'm going to have to do in technology to support that, because that's also going to be part of your budget cycle discussions, which I'm still involved with. Here I've captured a handful of presentations material on intelligence cycle. But the important thing to think about here, you can't read any of that, can you? We're going to start with requirements analysis. We're going to go through a planning and directions phase. We're going to do especially collections. So this is about collecting indicators of compromise, but also specific threat intel about actors. And we're going to go through a process and exploitation phase of our analysis. This is where we're going to assess the potential impact and relevance to our own infrastructure of threats and vulnerabilities. So I think it's important to mention that there is an easy, often, it's a frequent thing that I've seen occur, and I'm just as guilty of it in my own organization, is to conflate the terms threat and vulnerability. When it comes to the types of reports that I'm generating internally for my management team, as often as not, I'm really writing a vulnerability report with some specific information added to that about potential threat actors, because it's not necessarily the case that we know or are able to attribute observed attempts to hack into our infrastructure to the actual actors. So, for example, who all really believes that China is behind Sony, right? Well, we've seen attribution like that, but do you really believe it? We don't always even have that level of attribution, where we get something from the government that says it's this, that threat actor, or that threat actor. We hire a man, the answer is always China, right? So it depends on who you're talking to and who's giving you that type of attribution advice, who the threat actor is or may be. We're not really always able to get even that level of detail. Depending on who you're working with, you may or may not get detailed attribution information. Yes?
But do you at least take a look at kind of categorizing the threat?
Yes, absolutely. We'll get into threat risk assessment in just a bit, but that's an important aspect as well. So as part of the cycle, we're collecting specific threat information, but we're also going to cycle through how we mature that information and how we do risk assessment. And then once we've done an analysis step, there's obviously delivery or dissemination, but the key product for threat intel work group in the corporate environment, in my experience, is the reports. That is the deliverable. So a big part of the job is just pushing out reports. Just like pen testing, you don't get paid until you deliver the report, right? Assuming you're working for pen testing and not just doing it as a hobby. The planning and direction stage is always an optimization phase, so we always want to come back. There's a variety of presentations that you can see, views through prisms or lenses of this cycle. This particular set of slides, from this point forward, there's a handful here that are taken from NIST documents. This one is from SP 800-30 and -39. So they've taken the same approach and then shown that you need to do the same cycle but across multiple tiers of your organization. So basically, it's what we were saying as we started the talk. You're going to do the ISMS loop the same at the framework level. You want to do a risk assessment at an enterprise level. You want to do risk assessment at application level. But basically, we're following the same workflow throughout. There is a tendency to view threat intelligence and try to say that applies only to my technical assets. But there's also the need to do threat intelligence analysis around what are the threats to personnel, what are the threats to physical facility, what are the threats to key executives. Are those threats locally based? And do we do a different analysis on if we're looking at international travel, for example? But I think the scope of what your team does depends on the size of your organization, the size, the specific requirements of your management team. And in my case, our focus at the moment is IT and technical asset threat. So, wow, how many times can you see the same workflow? Again, from SP 800-30. More OODA loop. Really, you will never get out of the loop. You're stuck in a ridiculous cycle that never ends. This is the job you've asked for. It's like a swirling cesspool of you never can't stop processing threat. What's the exit strategy? Well, hopefully you're managing threat. I really like this slide. This is from Lanco. BAE Lanco, I think sponsors here today. This whole idea of context awareness and security from continuous response. Wow, I really like that. I think that's our objective. So this is something from Waypack Labs, who are a vendor of threat intelligence information. Did I mention? No, I didn't. But the company I work for is a financial sector vertical. So we are a member of FSISAC, and which is I think the premier threat information sharing organization, or amongst ISACs at least. And as such, we get a lot of exposure to threat intelligence coming from organizations. We also get subscribed information from Waypack and a number of other companies that are contributors. This did not come from that subscription. This is public-facing material. So I believe fair use applies. But the whole point here is to increase your process maturity and the typical capability maturity model. The categories are defined here. You're performing, you're managing. It's defined, measured, and optimized. So the different activities you want to be performing as you're doing threat intelligence, you can start to lay those out. And that gives you kind of an action plan for moving your program forward. So in my case, this is a case study that I put together around a fictitious company where you're basically starting up a program. We started by actually describing what the team does and making that information available as part of the program document that was provided to management team. Any similarities to any real-life company are completely accidental, but there may be some here. I think the most important thing to begin with as you're developing a threat intelligence program is to make sure that you have executive mandate for the group and the team and the effort. Without that, everything is a grassroots effort and is really going to be difficult to make headway as you try to implement process. The process is difficult enough as it is to get established in larger organizations where there is a legacy of this is the way we do things, we're not changing it just because you think it's a great idea. We run a lean shop. We have as few technical people as possible, so the new things you're asking us to do are going to be assigned the lowest level of priority because these people are already working on what are deemed to be business critical roles and responsibilities. So your thing, if it's not deemed business critical and given that criticality by your top level executive, it's just going to be something that gets put on the shelf and never gets implemented. And even if you do have executive approval, that may still also be a risk area. So that's certainly important. Defining your scope in terms of what types of threats are you going to be focused on initially. You don't want to set a larger scope than you can hope to achieve. Working just with your technical assets or your critical applications is probably a good way to start. You should avoid conflating threat and risk and vulnerability. But you should at the same time make sure that those terms are clearly understood by everyone in your company that may be getting your presentations and understanding what you're delivering. So getting definitions out of the way is relatively important in your program and worth talking about here. So I think everybody is probably aware of the difference between threat and vulnerability. Do you have any questions about that? Yeah. So we're basically looking to the potential source for actions against whatever vulnerable devices or applications that we might have. And being able to identify those sources means that we are able to possibly see patterns of attacks that come from there. We might be able to take remediating actions as simple as blocking their source IPs, but it may be more complicated by identifying the telltale signs of their attacks so that if they move to different source networks, we'll at least be able to see the type of attack that's occurring, recognize that sooner. We may be able to write more effective signatures for our IDS or firewall platforms or whatever other technologies that we have in place. So those are the goals. And of course, risk. Risk is a completely different animal. But risk is the generic score that we mostly want to communicate to the business. Risk is how the business manages financially the costs of running the business. So if we can assign a risk level and have a cost associated with that, now we're speaking in terms the business will understand. And that is an important thing to keep in mind. You should not talk about vulnerabilities or attacks when you go in front of the board. You want to tell them what's the cost of running my threat shop, what value have I added to the company by reducing risk overall, and what was the financial impact of the company. And if we can talk in those terms to the business, then we've really succeeded in our jobs. If you can't, then you're at risk. You're at risk for not keeping your job or not getting the funding that you want to run the threat shop. So there is a technical risk process. It's also the same risk process for business level risk, but again, it's really not at the right level to be able to read that. But this is actually taken from WAL, SB 800-30. It's another NIST, the same NIST document we saw before. You'll find it also in risk management discussions that are framed around ISO 27000. It's the same process, but identify threat sources, identify vulnerabilities, determine likelihood of occurrence, determine the magnitude of impact, and from that come out with a risk score. This is basically the day-to-day work of the threat intel team that goes into the reports that we generate. This report actually, where's my, thanks Securosis. But I think that it shows the integrations between incident response and threat intelligence quite nicely. So above and beyond just delivering reports to management, we want to actually have a close association with our incident response team and actually implementing mitigations. So that to me is the more operational aspect of threat intelligence. Having an established CCERT or CERT within your company is an ideal state to go into. You may have a company where you don't have such a thing established, and you need to define some roles and responsibilities there. And keeping a store as a central repository of threat intel information is useful because it gives you the opportunities at a future point to apply automation, and we'll talk about that just a little bit. And we've talked about this already, but you basically want to answer the 6 questions of who, where, what, why, what's going on, and we have beaten this to death. You should be able to speak in terms of threat assessment levels. When you're speaking to management, color coding is actually somewhat useful, but you need to have a quantitative method of arriving at that so that you consistently apply the same methodology of assessing risk. So even if you're doing qualitative risk assessment, at some point you should think about assigning some number level to the different things that you're evaluating. But you can get at that by, generally speaking, what's the exposure and what's the severity of that. And the severity and exposure then allow you to compute an impact value. So what would be the damage to my Windows environment if none of those systems are exposed to the internet and I'm getting attacks that are only coming from the internet? The impact on my enterprise would be low because I have no exposure. So it is important to maintain some situational awareness about how you're running your firewalls and what your overall posture is in terms of exactly where the attacks are coming from. It's also important to consider your internal, just looking at it from a network perspective, to consider your internal attacks and not to consider your internal network as being a protected citadel, because as you may know, probably this audience knows, oftentimes malware attacks give a foothold on your internal network to an external attacker who then has as much visibility into your internal network as he did with or without your firewall. So that's common knowledge, I think. But for management reports, colors are meaningful, especially at the board level. So if you could translate your threat assessment into a color-coded threat assessment level, this is really beneficial to you to be able to speak to management in terms that they understand. So you need to have a consistent way of applying vulnerability analysis and identifying potential threat actors and communicating that up the hill. I think maybe you know the basics of what you're looking at, but we want to know who the audience for our threat discussion is, what the severity and the urgency is. One of the biggest questions that comes to me all the time is, okay, so what about this freak attack? What about this freak vulnerability? What is my priority on patching? Should I interrupt all of my workflows and do an emergency patch process? Well, now we're just strictly talking vulnerability because there haven't been any identified attack instance weakness. There haven't been any observed attacks really. Some proof of concept stuff that may be developed, but in the wild, not a lot of active attacks against it. Completely different with Heartbleed, of course. The moment that went public, we started seeing scanning for it, which turned into real attacks against it. So there was obviously a much greater urgency when you see things that are live in the wild than there is when you don't see any type of attack. But that's my internal audience for reports that I'm delivering are the technical team as much as the management team. The technical teams who are doing actual patching across a distributed enterprise environment want to know what's the criticality, how quickly should I patch everything? Do I need to stop my normal patch processes and do this as an emergency patch? In my environment, we have a very strong change control group and paradigm, and we don't really do anything without executive approval if for emergency changes. So if you have a large organization, getting changes done with multiple presidential level approvals is a non-trivial task, and you really need to justify that accordingly. There's just a little bit about profiling threat actors that I've kept here. This is from a presentation. I forget the company who actually did it, but it's through a media share. But this is also something that we want to do on a regular basis. I think this one, it was worth mentioning some content that just came out this week, shared by InfraGard from OSAC. OSAC is something that's done by the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Diplomatic Security. And a new report that they released just this week had to do with identifying cyber threat per country. So they have a methodology that's really well described. It lines up well with what we're talking about and how you're doing threat assessments. But basically, you can see the computation of risk is exactly what I showed on one of the previous slides. It's a three-tuple based on threat, vulnerability, and impact. So I think this is a really common language you find, especially NIST is using it, and basically everyone. So this is also from the OSAC document describing basically you want to measure capability, intent, vulnerability, impact. And there's some materials that they provide that you can use if you want to do that on a nation-state basis. What are the risks that my company might see if I'm doing business in this country or that country? Was their point of view? I think it's also useful to take the same methodology and apply to what are the threat actors in those nation-states that may be targeting me. And I thought that some of the things that they mentioned here, especially towards the bottom of this, were interesting. That they felt that risk varies per organization, that threat remains constant per country. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, but capability remains constant per country, intent remains constant per country. I think it's a really broad view about that. I think in very large countries that's maybe not so true. I don't know that I would agree that intent remains constant across the United States, for example. There are a lot of threat actors in the United States of all sorts of different motivations. So it's interesting to me that the Department of State takes such a broad view of things.
As a nation state, or and we can say, as individual groups, that may be that.
Yeah, I agree.
That,
I think you're right, and it comes from that type of analysis, but their presentation was more towards what type of cyber risk do you incur by actually being there in that state. So for example, if I have executives that want to travel to or do business with computing technology and say they want to go to China, then I should measure the impact of that against my environment. Or if I'm doing business in China, what's the impact as opposed to, so I don't think it was really meant towards threat actors that are targeting me coming from those states, but really more about the threat of doing business in that state. And maybe that lens changes that view a bit, but maybe not. I mean, maybe you can look at it regardless of whether the attack is coming to me from the state as a state actor versus the cost of doing business there. I don't know that it changes. I think it's worth maybe doing the threat analysis with both lenses and seeing what are the net results, which I haven't done. So, fortunately for me, my company has a very focused domestic business, so that's kind of not really the point. The point to me that was just the methodology in doing the risk assessment was the same, and the tools that they have provided through their report, which is also the URL is listed here. Oh, by the way, it is the Department of State. It's osac.gov. I have the URLs for it, but you actually had to have a member of your organization establish a presence with the Department of State in order to gain access to that. Or you can gain access to the report through FBI InfraGard was the channel I received it. So they apparently are not just divvying that out to anybody and everybody. But there is, I guess once it's out, it's out. They'll have a hard time keeping it hidden. But if you try to go directly to the download URL, you probably won't be able to get it that way unless you take those registration steps, which are a little bit more tightly controlled than just regular, any old place. You can't read it, but it's a list of basically a bibliography that you can have from me if you want the slide deck and some similar references, some of the materials that I've mentioned here before now and some more there. I don't think we need to talk about vulnerability management per se, but penetration testing is always fun. Do you want to talk pen testing? Kill chain, where does that get? Yeah.
On vulnerability management, I found it very counterproductive to share vulnerability
That's a very good point. The statement was that we should not just deliver vulnerability information outside of the team that's dealing with and remediating vulnerabilities, and because you'll spend more time explaining that than you do actually getting work done. And I agree with that. So in my case, we talk about risk management and lowering the enterprise risk, and we want to provide a composite enterprise risk score to everybody else, so that basically we don't really open the kimono all the way. We just give a dashboard view of what's the enterprise risk today, and we would translate, for example, patch level to an established risk level. So if, for example, we've got a flat line of vulnerability on our server environment because we haven't been able to patch those servers, then just the fact that it's not trending downward, but it's flat and not going up, is good enough for management to see, have we improved our overall risk posture? But I definitely agree. You don't want to be talking about number of vulnerabilities or criticality of vulnerabilities that were patched last month. That just has no traction.
So to follow up on that, do you do mapping the vulnerabilities to, let's say, the exploit kits that are available? So here's the most popular black hole is using all of these various exploits. Do you map that to your vulnerabilities and say, I have this vulnerability, but it's a lot more important because it's part of an active exploit kit?
Right. I was trying to think if I had the particular slide in question, and it's not really before or after here. But yes, we do. I think we actually kind of breezed past it. So in the risk in that risk framework, we want to understand the threats and exploits, and then also the vulnerabilities. But that's going to give us a measure of adverse impact. So back to this this. Where did I put it? I probably missed it. I did miss it. We talked about it briefly, but I didn't dwell on it. But there is. Sorry for this, guys.
That's right. But the short answer is yes.
The short answer is yes. But there, yeah, okay. I did spend some time here. But measuring exposure rating and severity, also there's an impact score from exposure, which I said that already, exposure. But depending on exposure and then the severity of the vulnerability, basically is what we're talking about here, gives you a risk score that if it's down here, then you're basically going to map that up into like red or orange when you present that outside of your team. And so that's the whole point, is that we do want to map vulnerability and exposure to a residual risk value, and we want the residual risk to be lowered. And so showing over time, lowering the residual risk is one of the key performance indicators we can provide to say, here's the value of having our threat program. Historically, you were flatlined. We implemented the threat program, we drove the risk downward, the residual risk downward. So that in a dashboard view is exactly what you want the meter to start going, whichever side you have is green, trending towards green. So that's an important aspect. There's basically two major kinds of reports that my team delivers today, which I do not have examples of here because it's a little bit too much a work product. But we have daily, weekly, and detailed threat reports that specifically address vulnerabilities and threats per se, and are mostly given to technical teams as a key tool for them to drive prioritization of mitigation efforts. And then the other report that we give is a dashboard view that goes up the hill, which speaks towards threat trends and what are the primary topics that we're seeing as top trending threats. And without having the actual content here, we tend to do that today across the enterprise vertical. So we talk about trending threats across our vertical. And one thing that we still have yet to implement in my team is trending threats for our internal point of view with the internal lens on. So I can say that in the vertical today, the top threats that you see on an almost never changing basis are malware, phishing, DDoS. All right. So in the financial sector, There is a day-to-day, nonstop battle dealing with Dyer, Daritza, Patre, Cajios, it just, whatever flavor of the moment of malware that is being pushed out and being upgraded. So Dyer is like the new ZooSpot, if you don't know what that's about. And the challenge is, while in my corporate environment, I may have a lot of really solid foundational controls around endpoint security. I've also got a user base that's not in the corporate sector that you may have some parallels to that if you come from education or other verticals where you've got people that you have desktop controls on, and then you've got that set of people over there that's just the wild, wild west. And executives, students, executives, right? So we've got, you've got, okay, so bring your own, right? Bring your own disaster. You've got your Mac users where you may have a really strong program around Windows protections, but you haven't got the foundational controls around Mac support. Well, the fortunate thing is there's not a lot of malware attacking Macs yet, but it's coming, I think. Android devices are like really vulnerable at the moment to Freak, but you can't get that pushed out because the vendors, your phone companies aren't pushing out support for those devices, so you're going to have lingering vulnerabilities that exist. Lingering threat landscape that you can do nothing about because it's outside of your control. The only controls you're going to have are, what are my mitigating steps now? I make sure that they're never allowed on my corporate network, and if you did allow them like 6 months ago, then you made a big mistake, and for which recovery may be impossible. So you may really want to seriously think about network segmentation if you haven't already. So the whole kill chain thing for us, when we're doing incident response or we're doing mitigation reports, and we want to describe basically what controls we have at each step in the kill chain. So in my reports, I'm addressing kill chain by showing what mitigating steps are possible at different levels, so that that we can start to drive the discussion towards, let's do incident response as early as possible. Let's identify threat and actual attacks as early as possible. It helps to focus the discussion, and so, yeah, it may sound like a buzzword that's overused, but if you can find a way to deal with those aspects of the kill chain as you're talking about mitigating responses, or you're talking about enterprise controls, and start to structure your controls in such a way that they address specific parts of the kill chain, you'll find it more effective to communicate, especially the management team, about driving costs down. And more. Right, so actually I think I already mentioned patch management, and it's really all about prioritization of what you're doing there. Oh boy, sick of that? Right, so mapping this is actually a set of points that were taken from NIST content. It's not 800-30, it's a different one. But they're strictly talking about information lifecycle, but I think I always like, it's like cyber, right? Threat is the new cyber. Is it the drinking game now? You hear the word threat, let's take a drink. So put threat in front of any sentence. This framework is one that we're actually actively using in my enterprise. It's actually from CMU, the Software Engineering Institute. So it's something called the Collections Management Framework, and it's broken down into 3 major maturity model phases, which you cannot read that, but I have the source URL for you if you want it. That's a PDF. I've flattened that and broken that down into basically program model that we'll be using internally to more correctly identify stages of where we are in implementing the framework as we proceed over the next 3, 6, 12 months, and we'll be able to talk to management. We are at our desired state of an advanced threat intel program and leveraging the collections framework. And so by identifying these milestones that map back to the framework, it allows us then to identify maturity model states and push forward. In order to do those activities, I am going to need additional staff, technology, and I'm going to need cooperation from other parts of the business that have so far been slow to develop. and that will come at a cost, which we can start to identify because we'll be able to say who the roles and responsibilities are in those groups that need to interface with us and the type of work that they need to be doing to support us. So this is a major component of my program, is wrapping around this framework. I've also developed that into a maturity model by just laying out the activities that are high-level activities that are being done in the framework and showing a march towards an advanced or optimized state. So this is all my content. My content, but based on standing on CMU's shoulders. They also have some detailed breakdowns of what you can be doing actually to do your threat analysis. So their content is very, I think, useful in terms of defining actual procedures for your workforce to help them understand what should you be doing as part of your threat analysis activities. It's also useful to go back and use that as a review methodology when you're looking at, did you meet your key performance objectives over the past year? Here's how well you did at this task or that task. So I think it also helps us to map threat analysts' roles and responsibilities, but also to more clearly define them and give that information to HR. So when looking to hire a threat analyst, it's not always easy to understand what the role and responsibility is going to be because, as we said at the start of the talk, even threat intelligence is poorly defined. So what is a threat analyst role in my company as opposed to the defense sector is going to be a completely different animal. Hopefully not too completely different, but it will vary greatly. So establishing a dialogue with HR so they understand what the role and responsibility really is and they know how to vet the various resumes that they might get. I don't know if you've ever done hiring before for a large company, but you get a lot of resumes that you simply think are trash. People make up stuff or they'll send you resumes thinking, well, my background would make a great foundational background for the job that you have, but I have no experience whatsoever in what you're looking to hire. So you have to kind of sort through that and figure out, you know what, I really like him and I think he's actually right. Or, you know what, that's a great idea and everything, but I don't have the time to train somebody in this role. I need them now. So it's a real challenge to look at resumes and try to find someone that you think could really benefit the team, but at the same time not disqualify someone because they simply don't have a threat intel background. Finding someone with a threat intel background limits you pretty much to the intelligence community, people coming out of DOD, folks whose threat intel may have been around counterterrorism or insider threat with behavioral analysis. We all watch those TV programs where we think people are doing that, but whether that applies in the private sector directly can be a challenge. So that's real world experience with building a threat intel program. Oh my gosh. You want to prioritize risk. We've been saying that over and over and over again. But this framework here breaks it down into steps that are also mapped to the various levels of those three maturity levels. So again, clearly you can't read that. But I find this helpful in terms of identifying clear markers for where we are and where we want to be as we improve our program. You also can't read that, but that's my actual workflow that I established. We are basically developing swim lanes around those actual phases of threat intel. So we have planning phase or requirements analysis phase, a collection phase, an analyze phase, a dissemination phase. I've mapped different tasks in each of those phases that we can measure. Right? So the input and output to those phases will have key performance measurements against them, and so we'll be able to provide some indication to our management team of what kind of job are we doing operationally. So having operational performance metrics, I think, are important when you establish a program, because if you don't have them, you don't have good visibility into how well are you running your program. So you always have to think about the output being the number one deliverable, but also a day-to-day conversation with your managers. How good a job am I doing? Yeah, I want to receive good reports at the end of the year because it usually has a direct impact on bonus. And so I think it's important that you structure your program with measurable points in the program to allow you to deliver those type of indicators. This ties somewhat back to the framework, in fact, closely back to that framework. So I'm able then to show, as I'm improving the maturity of the program, where the investments in the program have started to pay off. If I have a key performance indicator in one process box that lag, even though we've invested there, then you probably want to do a root cause analysis to see why is that. Why haven't my investments paid off? Okay, nearing the end here, threat intel sharing is a topic that I think is really key to having an effective threat intel team. So as a part of the FSISAC, I'm also part of the cyber intel community there, and there is a lot of threat intel sharing that goes on in that community. Mostly TTP about actual either malware attacks, DDoS attacks, or phishing attacks, those being the main ones that we see day to day. That is a closed community that you can become a member of if your company is a financial sector company and pays to be a member of FSISAC, which, by the way, is the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, if no one knows what FSISAC means. There are other ISACs that are wrapped around basically the critical infrastructure categories, the 16 critical infrastructure categories that were defined as part of the Critical Infrastructure Protection Program, and you can learn more about that through the FBI InfraGuard program as one source of information. There are closed information sharing groups that you can become a member of. Usually those, you have to be nominated by an existing member and vetted into the organization or into the discussion, into the group. Those are really useful. I happen to be a member of one or two, and there is a lot, in my experience, a lot of overlap between those members and the FSISAC members, but also the advantage of being FSISAC, because it's made up of financial sector companies, there are limitations on the type of information that can be shared across those, between those companies, because of concerns about anti-competitive practices. So we don't want to be in violation of RICO. Yes. So there are limitations, and you may have seen through the cybersecurity framework that was pushed out there. It's been ongoing discussions, which came from NIST also, but there have been ongoing discussions. Also, President Obama just recently pushed an executive order out that he's hoping would clear the way, which it still has not done, because there is not supporting legislation to enable sharing to be done. Most companies are reluctant to do more proactive sharing because of concerns about liability and being sued or being brought to court for potential RICO violations. So there are these legal limitations that are preventing companies from sharing. In my own case, we have requests to share certain specific things that we have going internally to our Office of General Counsel, and we're still awaiting a finding or response from our own lawyers as to whether we can share that more broadly, even in these closed communities. So that's unfortunate. I see a lot of information coming from other companies, but I'm not able to share nearly as much as I would like to. I think capability evolution is this is actually from a NIST document, SP 800-150. It's a document that's actually in draft. It's not published yet, and it targets information sharing specifically. So if you have an interest in joining an information sharing community, you can find some ideas about information sharing best practices that are being developed by NIST and being discussed at a more global level. But basically the whole idea is you want to be sharing. Sharing gets you a lot of value in terms of being able to identify threats at an earlier stage. And there are additional ways you can break that down. This is my own internal attempt to do that. One method that once you start sharing, what you'll find is you'll get more threat indicators than you can possibly manage as a human. It's just like looking at your log data. You need a SIM to do your log correlation. You're not going to be able to do indicator correlation as a human, because you are going to get literally thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. As a member of the FSISAC, I've also been on the security automation working group, and that basically has led to the development and eventually spin-off of a new company called Soltra, which I'm only involved with as a potential customer, so I don't want to advertise them really per se, but most of their work product is available open source, or at least openly available for download. So what that product is a tool called Edge, which implements the protocols that were developed by MITRE to do information threat intel sharing or indicators complement sharing through protocols called Stix and Taxi. So once you implement Edge, then what you wind up are with you want to have established feeds through other threat providers, and you basically get indicators that, okay, so now you just got a big repo on the back end as a Mongo database that is retaining threat indicator information. You still need a SIEM or a log management tool to attach to this thing and do your correlation, because this is basically just a router for threat and intel information. Once you have that in place, though, I believe the capability that we still have yet to realize in my own enterprise, but it's kind of a faith-based thing. We want to move towards actually doing that and doing more automation so that we, I believe, reach a more, the ultimate, if not, okay, maybe it's the penultimate. It's not really the final stage of maturity, because I don't think you ever get there. But for us, a target mature state is automation around our threat intel and how we integrate that with finding context on our internal company through our internal logs. And well, we haven't integrated, we have not integrated Edge yet with SIEM, but that's part of the challenge with working with other groups that are lean and don't have the cycles to spare. So that's
integrated with other telemetry?
Not yet.
Endpoint visibility or network visibility?
No, not yet. We're receiving feeds, but we haven't integrated our own content there yet. So that's the next step for us as we move ahead with that.
So in the interest of staying on schedule, those are great questions. If you want to meet up in the back with more questions after the talk, that's fantastic. Right now what we need to do is swap out our speakers. Xavier, where are you? There he is. Next will be Xavier Ash doing